Okay, this following video is just to give you an overview of what you need to do when it comes to processing data and doing tables and graphs. But it assumes that you have actually accessed this data that is on our actual OneNote student book here. So under planning and conducting, there's videos on how to actually draw up your tables, how to actually work out your standard deviation. Don't worry about error, it will tell you that in the video. We're not going to worry about that for now, and how to turn all of that into a graph. It assumes that you have watched these videos, and it's just talking to you about what types of tables and what types of graphs you actually include in your report, because a lot of people are putting in any table and graph and not thinking about, okay, what do I need to put in my report that actually tells the story and addresses my research question. So this is how to use Excel, but the following video that I've just made and you're about to watch actually talks to you about how you actually pick what to put in your tables and your graphs to put in your report. Okay, so watch the following video to get a better idea of that. Okay, the next video here is on processing your data. So this is essentially taking your raw data and turning it into tables and graphs. And one of the things I've had to say to a lot of people is, you've got to be careful what you put in there. You need to have a table and a graph that tell a story. Don't have heaps and heaps. You should have just a table and a graph that tells the story. In fact, if you have too many tables and graphs and they do not actually help add to the story, they just take up space, in fact, you actually get marked down for that because you are not specifically pulling out the information that you need to actually show the trend or the pattern that actually tackles what was in your research question. So when you go, okay, I don't quite understand that, I'll explain what I mean. I'm just going to go back to here and do some writing. So say with the detergent one, when I was comparing the different detergents, I wanted to see if all of them actually were as effective at removing oil. So when my research question says that I'm comparing these different detergents, that is what my tables and my graphs need to summarize. Okay? What am I trying to compare is what you need to think. What are you needing to compare? Because that is what needs to be on your tables and graphs that are in your actual report. You give me a link to all your raw data in your Excel spreadsheet, and you do need to make sure that link works because some of those links didn't. But on your actual write-up, you simply have to have a table and a graph that shows the summary of the data, and it must be summaries. Okay, so on there I need to have down here your independent variable groups, and you don't have every single trial shown like I've seen some people with like heaps and heaps of trials for every single group. That doesn't help me to actually identify the trend. I mean, that actually makes it harder to identify the trend. Every single one of you, the first thing you do is you work out averages. Well, if you're working out the average, then use the average. That is what helps us to identify trends. We don't want all of that extra data there. We got rid of that by calculating an average. Okay? And once you calculate an average, you can see a trend. I might do a better picture than that. What about this one here? Now I can see a trend, okay? Averages are what we use to help us identify if trends are there or not. And then if you want to then talk about how all of your trials went in comparison to the average, well, that's what your standard deviation bars or your range is for, okay? So this is the other videos that I've put in there. When you calculate your standard deviation or your range, we actually use that to then show, okay, this is our average, but my data was spread out from like down here to way up here. I had a very big spread of data, whereas here my data was spread only from there up to there. So I actually didn't have a big spread of data at all. In other words, that had less error than that. Okay? So you need to find your average, find your standard deviation, and then your range, which is 2 times your standard deviation. That's what I want you to start with. And essentially when you report your results, and you'll see this in the actual examples that I've given you, let me just go over here. Example assessments here. when you actually report on your results, you'll notice, it's a bit hard for me to zoom in there, that it actually talks about the data plus or minus this here. Now that plus or minus is pretty important. That there tells me that that's their average and that is actually their range. Plus or minus that. Because that's saying my data ranged from this data point up to here and down to here. That's just their range expressed as a percent of the average. Now you don't actually have to do that. I just want you to find the range and then I want you to explain it as your average plus or minus whatever your range has been worked out to be. Don't worry about standard error. On limited numbers of trials it actually is a little bit hard and not as accurate, we have found. So just report your average plus or minus your range. So it could be with detergents, so I'll just go back. With my detergent, if I had an average loss or change of say 5 ml of detergent, but my top data point was like it lost 10 and my bottom was say, well, 2, my range, okay, was from 2 up to 10. Well, there's a change there of 8. I'm doing this without working out standard deviation, but it would be 5 ml plus or minus 4. Okay, you work out this using your standard deviation. It's actually a lot more accurate if you do times 2 your standard deviation than doing it the way I've shown it there. But does that make sense that you had an average of 5 and it went up and it went down? So it wasn't just 5, there was actually quite a big range of data there. Okay, that's what you need to do when it comes to doing your graphs. I just want to see averages and then the range set out in error bars like that, and I want to see that same data summarized in a table like that. You can have your raw data in this table all set out with your averages and standard deviation and stuff, but I do not want that placed in the graph because it obscures the trend or the pattern that you're looking for. Okay, on the other subject of graphs and stuff, you must have all of your titles, your axis titles, your units. Okay, don't just tell me how many bubbles you counted. You need to tell me that you counted bubbles. Okay, a lot of you just got numbers there with no units with it. Add all of those in because they actually do affect your marks, especially your communication mark, which is 2 out of 20. And it doesn't sound an awful lot, but it's really easy to not get a lot on that mark if you don't pay attention to these finer points. Okay, good luck. I'll do the next video on looking at our discussion interpretation of the graphs and then error analysis.